which reminds me, like the U.S. ambassador to China has sort of been on like this like propaganda kick on Twitter, talking about like China's great high-speed rails, or like, oh, isn't it great that the Chinese Communist Party has preserved the Forbidden City, such a cultural gemstone or something. And it's just like what is going on in this administration?
He's trying to be a diplomat, right?
I, w-
They're focusing on diplomacy.
Diplomacy is not constantly praising an authoritarian genocidal regime.
Actually, there was
I
a
think it
recent
is.
it's Burns, right? And the ambassador.
I think so.
Yeah, like there was actually a recent quote for him, something about how I can't remember the exact quote, but it was kind of about how China has been excessive, like it's gone too far in a certain thing, and so the the funny thing about that, I think Christopher Balding tweeted it with this um, about how it's like saying that John Bundy has exceeded the number of allowable murders for a serial killer or something like that. Just the idea that, oh well, if China didn't do some of these things so excessively,
I mean,
it would be okay.
Countries are allowed some, breathing room for how many people they kill within their country. It's just part of the game.
Just as long as you keep the genocide reasonable, right? Isn't
Mhm.
that the what the UN human rights chief essentially was saying when
What?
she came back from her
Oh,
tour
yeah.
of, like, the UN human rights chief Michelle Bachelet? She came back from her China tour,
Which was
right?
not an inspection, she said.
And she wasn't really able to see everything. There were limits, etc. And then she basically bought into the Chinese Communist Party framing of what's happening in Xinjiang, that like, oh, it's about counterterrorism.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
And this is another woman who has had a long connection with like socialism and communism.
but
throughout her life.
she was saying essentially that their counterterrorism policies need to re-examine those policies to make sure that they fall within international norms.
And
So it's
this
like
goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of the podcast about just how, the communist bandits will take words and like just reframe. Well, they'll reframe things, change the narrative about things. And so suddenly you're talking about completely different things, and they're just remaking.
But then they get the UN to accept that framing, right?
Well, I mean, it's because a lot of people in the UN have also grown up under, socialist or communist countries hold these beliefs. They're keyed into this worldview.
I don't think it's just that. I think it's also that they've spent 30-some years trying to take over the UN. And people haven't noticed.
That's true, too. But I mean, like Michelle Bachelet, like, she, after Pinochet took over Chile, which was her father was in the government, they were tortured. She fled to Australia and then decided to go to East Germany. So, like, it's not China that, like, made her go to East Germany. Like, she is already keyed into this. And there are people like this in positions of power all around the world. It's a problem. Like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. Like, that's a great example. Parents were in the Weather Underground. This was a San Francisco Attorney General responsible for the crime wave by not persecuting petty crime.
Not prosecuting.
Thank you.
A little different.
Yeah. Yeah. When I said it, I was like, something's not right. But yeah, his parents were, in the Weather Underground and spent their lives in jail for
Boudin
murdering.
was a big fan of Hugo Chavez.
Yeah, well, he's a translator in Venezuela.
I mean, he specifically congratulated Hugo Chavez, worked for the presidential palace, congratulated Hugo Chavez for abolishing term limits, etc.
Yeah.
So
God, term limits are so undemocratic.
It wasn't a secret that he had, more radical ideas about.
Well, once upon a time in this country, a guy like that would not have been elected to office. But, as Karl Marx said, the specter of communism is ruling the world.
I feel like it would have happened in San Francisco before.
Yeah, maybe.
Like San Francisco in the 70s would definitely have elected somebody like Chesa Boudin.
That's
true. San Francisco's been a funny place for a long time.
But yeah, in a lot of ways, even though we were not alive in the 70s, if you look back at a lot of the things that were happening in the 70s, it feels like a lot of the same things.
You see the mark of communism in a lot of
Right.
places.
Well, I mean, communist ideas began to spread in the late 60s, early 70s I mean, you could trace it back further, right?
Oh,
You
there's
talk
a
about
you're,
beatniks in the 50s and so on. Like you can go back as much, but like
the Frankfurt
Frankfurt School.
School.
Yeah. So okay. So yes, you can go back and look at that, but I would say that it was really the 70s when it started to become more and more mainstream and okay to have communist ideas and not have people laugh at you for being stupid.
Oh, the Long March through the universities.
Right. And so the
institutions.
students of the 70s became the professors of the 90s and the 2000s. And now you have a new generation where basically like there's now been 1 to 2 generations of very radical people in academia and increasingly in leadership positions in elected office. And, while I do think that it's good to have a spectrum of views, when the spectrum includes people who are heavily influenced by the Chinese Communist Party, that's the part that I'm super concerned about.
Well, I think this is why Xi Jinping, in his whole speech about human rights, was like, we need to make sure that our, this Marxist human rights framework, we promote that, we set up academic institutions for it, like we promote that in schools,
Right.
etc., because that will also influence the outside, academia in other countries when
primed for
they
it.
Right.
they study China, right? Like
Right,
when
we're
you
like,
work with Chinese universities.
Yep.
You have like, your alma mater, NYU, Chris, like has their Shanghai branch. And like, it's hard to see that not being influenced to some degree.
Oh, please. Yeah, that's totally,
Yeah.
terrible.
So like, yeah, it just seeps in slowly. And like, we don't have a mechanism in this relatively free country to stop that very easily.
I don't think it's like we don't even have a good way of exposing it in a certain sense.
It's tricky because like you always get the like, oh, well, that's not real communism. That's not what communism is. And it's this whole like changing definitions. It's so mercurial that it's hard to like for just like a normal rational person to like articulate the problems with it because it creates its own weird internal logic.
Well, it's also very hard to, if you actually read, like I was trying to read the Chosha article that Xi Jinping wrote, and it's dense, right? It is full of, the title was something like "Unswervingly Follow the China's Human Rights Development," blah blah blah. It's just
very pseudo intellectual,
but like it's full of that type of essentially communist theoretical language in Chinese.